Hey everyone, my proposal today is an introduction to the history of battleships, these giant steel warships that dominated the seas from the late 19th century to the Second World War. And I'm going to tell you about how and why they have been designed and built, why they have become obsolete at some point. And I will also elaborate a bit about the stories of famous battleships such as the German Bismarck or the Japanese Yamato. I let my inner kid pick this topic, I won't deny that. But as always, I hope you will find it interesting, and I wait for your comments and ideas for my next videos. As I said before, battleships appeared in the 19th century. But as you can imagine, they had ancestors. They are an evolution in the design of warships. And actually their name, battleship, is the contraction of a phrase, line of battle ship, which refers to the military tactics used during the Age of Sail in the 17th and 18th centuries. During this period, when two large fleets, fought at sea, they would typically line up one ship after the other, presenting their flanks to the enemy fleet, so that they could maximize their firepower, because the guns were on the flanks and they could not be moved. And this alignment of ships was called the line of battle. It is also during the 18th century that the concept of capital ship, very large and powerful warship with strong firepower, appeared, and the battleships of the 19th century are their successors. The evolution in the design of warships in the 19th century reflected technical progress with the introduction of various innovations, such as steam for the propulsion, which was more predictable than wind, the development of the metalworking industry that allowed the creation of armoring on warships, and progressively wood would be replaced by steel as the main material to build warships, and also the appearance of explosive shells that replaced the cannonballs that had been used in artillery for centuries. And these shells were obviously much more dangerous and destructive against wooden ships, which dramatically changed the design and the materials used to build warships. In the first half of the 19th century, countries that had begun their industrial revolution, like the UK and France, introduced steam propulsion in their navy, forcing the others to follow. With the introduction of shells, it was now very dangerous for a ship to be high on the sea, and the design of ships evolved more and more with a very low line, so that the ship would not be an obvious target for enemy shells when engaged in combat. And in the second half of the 19th century, in order to protect against shells, the use of armoring, first with iron and then with steel, was generalized. Now that the ships did not have the high flanks they used to have before, where the guns were positioned, all the artillery was moved on the upper deck of the ship in batteries and turrets that could be oriented. And this new design of warships is called the ironclad, which is the ancestor to the battleship. In conflicts of the 1860s, 70s, 80s, these ironclads were used and were the most powerful warships available in the American Civil War, for example, and they showed their superiority, forcing every nation to modernize its fleets. Now in the 19th century, the largest and most powerful navy in the world was the British Royal Navy, which since the 18th century had dominated the seas, but in the last 2 decades of the century, the Royal Navy started to be challenged by the ambitions of various other countries, and especially Germany. By the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, there was an extremely fierce competition between European powers on a technical, industrial, colonial, commercial level. This competition, this antagonism, implied an arms race between European powers, and this extended obviously to the navies as well. The ironclad design had evolved with new innovations, more efficient engines, thicker and more resistant armoring, and the term battleship was now used to name the largest modern warships. There were other designs and sizes of warships too. When the ships were smaller and faster, they were called cruisers. When they were even smaller and dedicated to the escort of larger units or specific tasks, they were called destroyers. But the battleships, because they were the most powerful and also expensive units, were considered the most important strategically, and they were always the pride and symbol of the might of any country's navy. And I said that at the end of the 19th century, the British Royal Navy started to be challenged, in particular by Germany, because there were about 100 battleships in the world in the 1890s, about 40 in the Royal Navy, 20 in the French Navy, and the rest in the navies of other countries. But the German plans anticipated the building of almost 40 new battleships that would have put the German Imperial Navy on par with the Royal Navy. This only fed the arms race and led to a reaction with the invention of a revolutionary design called the Dreadnought by the Royal Navy. The Dreadnought was the name of a ship, but it was so influential in the design of battleships in the following decades that it gave its name to the new generation of battleships, and all the ones built before the launch of the Dreadnought in 1906 are called pre-Dreadnought battleships. The Dreadnought is the ancestor to all other battleships that would be built in the 20th century. Its design looks very much like the battleships of the Second World War, and it had a more powerful armor than everything that had been seen before. It was faster thanks to steam turbine engines, which was another innovation for the propulsion, and it also had the largest and most powerful guns ever put on a battleship, with guns of more than 300 millimeters. It was also a massive ship, 160 meters long, that's about 500 feet, so that when it was launched, the Dreadnought was the most impressive, the most powerful ship ever built. This arms race continued in the first years of the 20th century and ended with the First World War, in which most European countries were involved. And even though the decisive battles took place on land and not on the seas, because the Allies had a rather clear domination of the seas, there was a large-scale battle in 1916, the Battle of Jutland, between the navies of the UK and Germany, which ended inconclusively, but remains the largest battleship fight ever. The end of the First World War in 1918 put an end temporarily to this arms race, not only because European powers had realized the disastrous consequences of their competition, but also because they were financially militarily exhausted by the war. Actually, the decline of European powers and the rise of the US as the world's superpower begins with the First World War, which lets most European nations ruined and forced to reassess their ambitions. In order to prevent another extremely costly arms race, a treaty, the Washington Treaty, was signed in 1922 between various powers, the US, the UK, Japan, France and Italy, that limited the number and the size of the large units they could have in their navy. Between the two world wars, in the 1920s and 30s, the doctrine in every large navy in the world still put the battleships at the center of everything. They were considered the ships that would determine the winner should a new war begin. And this despite the appearance of new strategies and new weapons that could be a threat for battleships. First, the development of torpedoes, especially used by submarines, and this new weapon that to a certain extent during the First World War had showed its power. Germany had developed a large fleet of submarines, but even though submarines had been efficient in sinking transport ships and disrupting commercial routes, they were not considered powerful enough to threaten a battleship. And in the 1920s and 30s too appeared the first aircraft carriers, but planes were not considered powerful enough to destroy a very heavily armored ship. So that in the 1930s, when a new arms race began, this time impulsed by Germany and Japan, the priority remained to build extremely heavily armored warships with powerful guns, the fastest warships possible, that were considered the key to the supremacy on the seas. And in the 1930s, Germany developed a program with the creation of the two largest battleships it ever built, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, which is a sister ship of the Bismarck, whereas Japan designed the largest battleship ever made, the Yamato. The Yamato was about 4 times bigger than the Dreadnought I talked about earlier. The weight of the Dreadnought was 18,000 tons, whereas the Yamato was 65,000, and one of the heaviest ships ever built in history. It also had the largest guns ever put on a ship, 400 millimeters, able to destroy another ship at a distance of almost 20 kilometers, and its armor was also impressive. The sides of the hull were 40 centimeters thick. That's about 16 inches of steel. However, when the Second World War began, it appeared quickly that the battleships were much more fragile and less efficient than anticipated. In the Atlantic, first, the German battleship, the Bismarck, was destroyed by the British after having been spotted by airplanes. And in the Pacific, the first attack of the war, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, was essentially carried out by the planes transported by aircraft carriers that had traveled all the way from Japan to Hawaii. And actually the losses of the US Navy in the attack on Pearl Harbor were essentially battleships and cruisers, which were important, but not as much as the aircraft carriers, and by chance all the aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were at sea during the attack, so that they were spared, and just a few months later the Pacific Fleet was already able to counterattack. And actually in the following battles, be it the Battle of the Coral Sea and even more the Battle of Midway, the aircraft carriers would prove to be the most important by far units, and the ones that would determine the control of the ocean. So that by 1942 already, everyone had realized that the time of battleships was over, and that now aircraft carriers would be the key units to dominate the seas. And this is why the Second World War was the end of the battleship, with every nation except the US abandoning battleships. They were used now only, and this is why the US kept them as ships that could support land operations on the coast, thanks to their very strong firepower. The Yamato, that had been built by the Japanese and remained the most powerful battleships on the seas, would be destroyed during the war. It participated in various battles, but was never able to play a decisive role, now that the fighting could happen even when the fleets were at 100 or 200 miles of distance. The Yamato was damaged in the Sea of the Philippines in 1944, and then it was sent back to Japan to be repaired, and was finally sacrificed by the Japanese Navy in a suicide operation in 1945. Its wreck is under the sea off the coast of Okinawa in the south of the Japanese archipelago. With the development of new technologies and weapons, warfare continued to evolve after the Second World War, putting an end to this age of gigantism that the battleships represent. Now with the weapons like guided missiles, the importance strategically and tactically of submarines, the very long range of bombers, it is unthinkable to build very large and heavily armored ships because they would be extremely fragile and easy to shoot targets on the seas. But because they were so impressive, battleships have had a lasting impact in popular culture. Just look, for example, at the space operas, the war spaceships you have in many of them are actually space battleships that are no longer credible on the seas on our planet, but continue to fascinate us. I hope you enjoyed this moment and that I'll see you soon with another video. Au revoir.